Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It seems like this is one of those weeks that begins with when the temperature is close to 20 degrees Celsius and kind of ends when it's closer to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. How many of you have kind of had the one more layer, one less layer, heat on, heat off, window? There's been a lot of that, I think, this week. There was one day at the office where, I don't know what happened here, but the thermostats were reading 85 for no good reason, except every good reason, because it was just warm outside and everything was all, balagan, as we say. So yesterday, somewhere between home and the synagogue, I kind of got into that usual thing that's happened to me all week, where I was like, too many layers, too few layers, gloves on, and as I was considering the physiology and sweat, no sweat, whatever it was, I suddenly found a little bit of panic coming on, because what I realized, beyond the weird temperature thing that's happening, is that my mobile phone was not in my pocket. Thank you. I really appreciate that support. Thank you. So it wasn't just the effects of the temperature, but they pointed something out to me, and I was halfway to the office and didn't really have time to turn around before my first meeting. And by the office, I mean the synagogue, right here. There's some offices upstairs on this floor. If you haven't been, we'll give you a tour. And it took about 15 minutes for the anxiety that just kind of got dumped on me, in addition to any of whatever I was feeling about, proper amount of layers. It took about 15 minutes for that to just wash over me over and over and over again. But at a certain point, it occurred to me that it was starting to dissipate. This was like an amazing thing. How could I have left the house without a phone? There's appointments. I have to be at 3 different off-site appointments today, and this and this and this, and communicate. And what if Ivan needs to reach me? And what if my family? The whole thing. As the day rolled on, I had to remember, of course, to remind colleagues that I didn't have my phone in my pocket. And it continued to be, though, that the more time that passed, the less I worried about it. In the middle of the day, I even had an opportunity where I could have run home in between things. But for some reason, I was a little late to this wonderful kind of seasonal staff holiday thing we were doing. And the last thing I wanted to do was be later for that. So I chose not to pick up the phone. And I'm convinced that I would have picked up the phone. That's funny to say pick up the phone. I would have gone home to get the phone. Now it's sounding like an ET reference. Let's roll back on this language here. I would have retrieved my telephone. I'm convinced I would have retrieved my telephone if it had only been a half hour or something, or an hour after I left it. But 5 hours after I left the phone at home, I was in this very different headspace about the necessity of walking around with a phone attached to me in my pocket. It was a unique sense of freedom. Now, last week's Torah portion began with Yaakov, with Jacob, our patriarch, fleeing his family home because he has just stolen his brother Esau's blessing from their father. This week's Torah portion, we've already advanced in time practically a generation, because it opens with Yaakov about to reunite with his brother, his estranged brother. Yaakov has 4 partners, 12 kids. His brother Esau, has done well too. The 5th verse of the Parsha does something that the Torah doesn't always do. It tells us exactly how Yaakov felt. Vayira Yaakov me'od. Yaakov did not just have trepidation on the eve of reuniting with his brother. He had a lot of trepidation. Vayira Yaakov me'od. Me'od. Yaakov prepares a parade of gifts for his brother Esav, mostly animals. He separates the family in two. He leaves them overnight. He wrestles with a man in the night. He receives a new name. He limps away from the encounter at dawn. This is like, I don't know, better than the gay 1970s in New York City. It was a really big night for Yaakov. And finally, in the morning, he sets out to greet his brother. Esav is so gracious to his brother Yaakov. And Yaakov did not necessarily expect this. We heard about his trepidation. He is so gracious that he doesn't even want to accept this menagerie, right? Dozens and dozens of animals coming toward him, along with the family coming and paying their respects. Each of Yaakov's partners and all the children, part of the household by part of the household, one by one. And in the middle of this series of events, Yaakov says to Esav, Ra'iti fanecha kirot pnei Elohim. Ra'iti fanecha kirot pnei Elohim. Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. So in Torah time, in just a few dozen verses, we've gone from Yaakov praying to the God of his ancestors that he would be saved by his brother's hand, fear of his own life, to now saying something to his brother that compares seeing Esav to seeing the face of God. It's a big transition. Now, I don't want to go too much competition, between like biblical characters, but it should be noted that Moshe, right, we call the Torah the 5 books of Moses, that Moshe, our teacher, our prophet, is said to have known God panim el panim, face to face. Yet, when Moshe, stationed on the mountain, asks God to see God's face, God is abundantly clear that you do not see God's face and somehow like come out the other side okay, right? No one can see my face and live, says God in that interaction. So we presume from this that panim el panim doesn't necessarily actually mean literally seeing someone's face, but knowing something about them intimately, that Moshe had this intimate relationship, uniquely intimate relationship with God. But interestingly, we also have commentaries that suggest that panim el panim can be a military term. Think face-to-face, think hand-to-hand combat, that kind of imagery. Now, that is not a great description of Moshe's relationship with God, I don't think, though there's definitely pushback. And it's not a great answer to Yaakov saying, God, I hope everything goes well when I meet my brother. God doesn't come back and say, great, you and your brother are going to have hand-to-hand combat. Instead, something happens with this mysterious being in the night, but things really do go well for Yaakov and Esav. In the case of Moshe, Moshe asks for what he wants. I want to see your face. Show me your face. And the text tells us that God, maybe in some compromise, gives Moshe a glimpse of God's back. Any of you ever climbed Mount Sinai in the peninsula, Sinai Peninsula? So you might remember there's this kind of experience you can have climbing up the mountain. About 2/3 of the way up, there's this crag in the rock, and it's associated with the place where this happens, where Moshe is kind of asked to stand, and God is going to pass over Moshe, and Moshe will somehow experience God's back, but not God's face. In the case of Yaakov, in the case of Jacob doesn't even ask to see God's face at all. But what he does do is on the eve of reconnecting with his brother, he pours out his anxieties from his heart. Why did I leave my phone at home? How am I going to get... No, more anxieties than that, more serious anxieties than that. We can imagine, right, the prayer of like how this is could probably go so wrong. There's so many ways this could go wrong. He wanted to kill me. I took his stuff. I was wrong, but should he kill me? I mean, this is just going to be awful. He was also quite strategic in preparing material gifts for his brother. He took care of his family, Yaakov, that evening, and then was left all alone for that encounter. And after that wrestling match between terrestrial and celestial realms, he named the place where that took place Peniel, meaning the face of God, because the text tells us he had seen a divine being face to face. What's interesting is that most of our commentators don't like to say, oh yeah, Yaakov saw God face to face. It says Elohim, that's one of the words for God. Instead, they point out that Elohim can mean a lot of other things. Elohim can mean lowercase g, gods. Elohim can mean judges. Maybe Elohim can even mean angels. And maybe this is why we start to tell this story a little bit about Jacob wrestling with the angel, even though that might be an oversimplification of what happens. I want to be bold tonight and suggest that it's God, that the word Elohim here can be read as God, and that somehow or another, in some material or metaphorical way, Yaakov wrestled with God, God's self, received this new name, Yisrael, that is added onto his name and becomes the name of our people. And somehow or another, by the time he meets his brother Esav the next day, he has a whole different idea about what it means to encounter holiness. And he recognizes it right there in his brother who he had completely different expectations for. His brother who he thought would hate him, his brother who maybe he hated him, his brother for whom he poured out his prayers to God, for whom he sent dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of animals in advance, his brother for whom he separated his family, because what if they attack this group or this group, maybe some of them will survive. It seemed like Yaakov did whatever he could to prepare for this reunion. And whether he knew it or not, it seems like once he was done with all these preparations, when he was left on that other side of the river, he actually did something radical, which was he let it go. He let it go. He didn't perseverate on this every single moment, all the way up until the encounter with Esav. He was left alone. And something happened over the course of that night, and maybe that thing happened over the course of the night because he had made room for a different kind of reality, a different kind of experience, that had he continued to stay in this one single reality about, I'm worried, what's going to happen with my brother, it's going to be awful, please save me, save me, save me. But somehow, after he did everything he could, he recognized that and he let it go. Yesterday, as the hours went by, the sense of freedom I had from my telephone continued to be present. And they morphed into things like, oh, I'm having a real conversation over lunch, and I'm not occasionally tapping my knee and thinking we're going to look up that thing we just talked about, because how can we go through the meal without looking up whatever, Googling the such and such, right? Or walking across 34th Street and not only vaguely being aware that Macy's was across the street, but actually being like, wow, Macy's. This is a New York landmark, and people come from around the world at this season to look at this department store. And it just kind of it's an experience I didn't exactly expect to have. Earlier in the day, it occurred to me that I might have to remember a few phone numbers as well. And maybe one of the things that carrying that phone around in our pockets does to affect our immediate reality is it actually literally affects our minds in that way. If you think, for those of you who have existed in realities where you remember non-cell phones, perhaps most of the phone numbers you know are phone numbers from 20, 25, 30 plus years ago. That is certainly the case for me. Maybe for me, the best opportunity was the occasion where I actually asked for help from someone else and said, hey, would you mind sending a text to so-and-so to just let them know that I'm here now but was running late, or I don't have my phone with me and couldn't reach out? Look, I don't want to compare directly my silly phone-at-home experience with the profound experience of the patriarch who our people is named after, being in this incredible life-altering experience on the eve of, then continuing with the actual reconnection with his brother. But I do think that message of changing our reality is something that carries through both from the ancient text until now. Simple math would suggest that if I'm doing this thing right now, that it's hard to do this thing right at the same time. Or if I'm really focused on this, then I can't focus on that. So by changing our reality, by changing our focus, we might notice something that we hadn't noticed before. Many of you started this week at CBST on Monday evening when we did a community town hall that we called So What Now, kind of in between Election Day and Inauguration Day. And several people in our community, Diane Burhany, Rabbi Marisa James, and State Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel all spent some time talking about how they've been thinking about this time in their roles and from their perspectives. And part of what I appreciated about just the 8 or 10 minutes each of them spoke for was it gave me a glimpse into a different reality. Not necessarily such a alternative universe, but kind of like, oh, that's a little something about Albany, and I'm finding a little hope there. Or this is a little something about what we know about psychology and self-care, and it's great to be reminded about this. Or here are the things that we know about immigration and the opportunities and the risks and the threats that there are right now in New York, or what we might expect in the new year, in the new administration. So sometimes changing our reality can mean going somewhere we've never been. Maybe it can mean leaving our phone at home. But maybe it can also be when we find ourselves in a situation that we didn't even plan for, something that we're anxious about, being with someone we're afraid of, that instead of running away from it, we stay in it. And we allow ourselves to feel what we feel, and we recognize that when we do that, we might learn something new. We might have a different kind of experience. By shifting our reality a little bit, we might not have all the answers, but if we make room for it, we also might find glimpses of the face of God. And I think we can all use some glimpses of the face of God right about now. So I hope we can all find some of those. Shabbat shalom, everyone.